In unstable build 42.15, the Indie Stone implemented a gamepad aiming prototype for controllers that lets them finally participate in the aiming mechanics introduced in build 42. Is the new aiming functional? Yes, but it leaves much to be desired. That's not surprising considering it's labeled a prototype. Since it is a prototype, the developers are welcoming lots of feedback. I get to throw my 2 cents into the arena with approval this time. Let's start this discussion from the beginning. In Build 41, controllers operate in the beloved twin-stick style of mini top-down shooters. The direction you point the right stick is the direction your character faces, while the left stick is the direction they move. I wouldn't go as far as saying it's perfect for Zomboid, but it's pretty close. Obviously, controllers will never be great at inventory management. There's a reason why Valve, a PC-focused company, continues to include touchpads in their PC-focused controllers to allow for more natural UI usage. That doesn't mean the PC controller setup is perfect in non-UI cases either. For example, to run, you need to press the left analog stick in the direction you want to go, which makes you walk. Then hold the right trigger to start running. This is a direct keyboard emulation of pressing WASD to walk and holding shift to run. Yet that is not how consoles have traditionally used controllers. Since the analog stick is an analog input, most games have you walk with partial input and run at full input. Here I'm showing it off via Steam input to replicate the behavior. It's much more natural to run this way. If you pay attention, there are many clunky bits like this that stray from the more traditional controls console players are used to. I bring this up because reinventing the wheel is time-consuming and frustrating for everyone. In order to smooth out the controller experience, they may need to start the redesign process farther back than expected. That's enough rambling, it's time to get back on topic. In Build 41, you aim at zombies by pointing in their general direction and shooting. Your character chooses the closest zombie within their firing cone, then rolls their chance of hit and damage based on distance, moodles, the gun, and your aiming skill level. It's very RPG-like, and I enjoy that system even if it has some flaws. For example, the inability to choose exactly which zombie you want to shoot at. Initially, when the new aiming system came out in Build 42 Unstable, they added a reticle that you'd hold over the zombie you want to shoot, and it still did the whole RPG accuracy roll stuff. In my opinion, this is the best form of the aiming system. You can choose which zombie to shoot, but it's still RPG-ish while taking into account things like objects blocking the projectile's path. In Build 42.12, they expanded on their limb targeting system by adding damage multipliers to each limb. This addition heavily focuses on player-targeted headshots, due to the other limbs taking significantly less damage. In a hotfix to the .12 build, the accuracy system was disabled, whether intended or not, and now guns always deal damage. This removes the RPG-like feel and detracts from the purpose of the aiming skill. Clicking on heads replaces the need to level up the skill to increase your damage output. The outer part of the reticle is now pointless as it shows your chance of hit based on the old system, even though you effectively always have 100% chance of hit. Mind, most players can't figure out how to level it in single player anymore, considering you have to fulfill the old accuracy requirements to gain XP. In multiplayer, all shots grant XP. I released a video around this time titled, "Are Guns Finally Good in Build 42.12 Unstable?" In that video, I called out the design of player-targeted headshots went against the developer's stated goal of controller support, as controllers are not precise enough to target heads from an isometric perspective. Hence the new mouse emulation style aiming prototype. If this system had been introduced before the push towards headshots, it likely would have been a success from day one. It wouldn't even need aim assist. So how does this thing work? When you move the analog stick, the cursor slowly scrolls towards its relative position on screen. This lets you reproduce where the cursor will end up by putting the stick in the same spot every time. However, the cursor is anything but quick. It's an okay speed when you have no targets and slows to a painful crawl once you do have a target. They also apply this slow scrolling cursor emulation to melee targeting. I think most players immediately identified this as far inferior to the previous aiming for melee attacks. I recommend disabling it for melee. As for gunplay, the aim assist slowdown is almost required due to the constantly moving nature of the cursor. Even though you can quickly move the stick to the correct position, you find yourself overshooting to speed up the cursor, then trying to catch it right as it gets to your target. Yet every time you move the stick, the speed and direction of the cursor changes, leading to constant swaying if you try to quickly target anything. It's actually so bad you can miss targets in melee if you aren't careful. If you want to experience this feeling with a mouse, just try to aim at a moving zombie's head by panning to near max distance. Every adjustment of the mouse causes the camera to pan a slightly different way. While you can account for this constant panning with the mouse due to its precise nature, it's easy to miss your shots. The next part is probably worse. The center point of the cursor isn't aligned with the player. It's below them from the camera's perspective. Anytime you want to target a nearby enemy, you run into two issues. Issue 1 is an enormous default dead zone applied to the sticks. At least it was that way for me. You can't precisely aim at nearby enemies because it doesn't accept inputs close to the character. You can change this via a sensitivity setting in the controller options. You gotta hold your mouse in just the right spot to actually click these buttons, by the way. You might want to improve that. The second issue is the starting location of the cursor and the fact that it doesn't immediately reset to its starting point when you stop aiming. Cursor starts below the character, then scrolls in your chosen direction. This means targeting a nearby zombie above your character first faces your character away from it. It will straight up kill you in melee and makes it harder to target heads at close range with guns. Finally, when you stop aiming, the cursor slowly scrolls back towards the center while it is hidden, instead of immediately returning there. If you decide you need to turn around to face a sudden threat behind you, even if you flick the stick through the dead zone, the cursor slowly scrolls from one side of the screen to the other. It's also a hindrance if you want to stop aiming far away and aim closer. By tapping the stick repeatedly, you can see just how slowly it returns to center. It would have to immediately reset to center for this style of aiming to work. So how would I improve this prototype aiming system for controllers? Personally, I would return to a point before limb-specific targeting. Controller players would no longer need the level of precision required for headshots. The existing prototype with a few minor edits, such as turning off aim assist, would completely fulfill its purpose. As I stated before, I prefer an RPG-type system over the current one when it comes to damage and the progression of leveling your aiming skill. It would also reduce the amount of development required overall. However, if the answer to returning to the older system is a solid no, I've come up with a list of changes that will bring the prototype up to a proper standard. Most of these I expect are already on their list. Prototypes aren't exactly finished products after all. I assume I'll just be confirming what they already know. First, I would implement 4 new controller-specific settings. It's important to do this before changing anything else, as limits of the input method need to be found before you can design game mechanics around them. In a live development process like the current Unstable, it'll also give players something to do other than complain. Setting 1 would be a toggle to allow a player to turn off the new aiming when using melee weapons. Setting 2 is a slider that adjusts the smoothing or scrolling speed of the cursor without a target, from no smoothing to the current amount of smoothing. For example, Steam Input allows you to emulate no smoothing via its mouse region setting. Here I am doing just that. Excuse my right thumb's poor joystick foo. I'm not used to such high sensitivity. It's so high you can see it move when I press the right bumper to shoot. What you do not see is the constant movement plaguing the prototype aiming system. Without glacially paced smoothing, I can actually hold my aim point. I think most would prefer this over constant adjustments. It's easier to aim like this for me at least. Setting 3 is a slider to adjust aim assist when you do have a target, from no aim assist to max aim assist. I think this alone would have prevented a majority of complaints, as the excruciatingly slow aim assist speed is a primary offender in terms of clunkiness. The amount of aim assist applied should probably scale to the speed of the target. That's what they do in most console shooters like Call of Duty, so it's probably a good idea. There's also a problem with what counts as a target. Cars and windows trigger aim assist when they really shouldn't. Setting 4 is actually multiple settings, as we need a better in-game way to adjust dead zones. Changing dead zones in the config file manually and reloading it has some odd behavior, almost like it's adding stuff together instead of treating them as individual settings. The sensitivity setting currently applies its scaling to every dead zone value. 3 of those would probably do the trick. That would help with the no-go zone near the player, as targeting is relative to stick position. Any amount of dead zone removes the ability to target near the player in the current system. Eventually, you may have to do some transformation of inputs so dead zones don't affect the center point for those with worn out controllers or accessibility issues. Speaking of the center point, it needs to be moved under the player. It's obvious this has to be done, so I just assumed it was overlooked for the prototype phase. Every input causing the player to briefly face down is an unacceptable issue if it persists beyond a band-aid fix. And that's it for my feedback on the prototype aiming system. It's honestly not far from where it needs to be. A toggle to turn it off in melee, a couple new settings for customizability, fix up the center point, and finally limiting aim assist to proper targets, something like zombies, animals, and players with PvP turned on. Now I get to talk about Steam Input. Steam Input is an extremely customizable system allowing controllers to emulate mouse and keyboard controls in PC games. Even when you use the default Zomboid controller settings, using Steam Input to add in a few keyboard keybinds to extra buttons, such as the paddles on many newer controllers, adds a ton of functionality Project Zomboid's default controls are missing. This needs more support. Right now, when you start using a controller, the game blocks some keyboard inputs. I think way back in the day it didn't do this, and you could go full hybrid with your usage. Things like switching to a controller on the fly when you start driving, as the controller driving experience is simply superior. But then swap back to mouse and keyboard for general gameplay. Nowadays, you need to unplug a USB controller to switch back to keyboard, and if your controller is wireless, you're out of luck because I've yet to find a way to bring up this menu on a wireless controller. Turning it off doesn't trigger the menu. Actually, that's not true. If you run your controller through Steam input instead of letting the game directly detect it, turning it off will trigger the menu. I guess Steam emulates a wired controller and Windows does not. Anyway, please implement the switch back to keyboard button on the pause menu when a controller is being used. This is important because there are devices that cannot have their controller unplugged. For now, there's a mod that lets you switch between the two control types, which I recommend for any controller if they want to quickly swap for loot sorting once they get home from a trip. Also, for the love of God, stop moving the default inventory position when you activate a controller. It achieves nothing, and it's frustrating having to re-customize your inventory panels every time you switch back and forth. I don't think it's particularly necessary to include a way to return to keyboard controls if the game fully supports hybrid controls. There are benefits in accessibility too, since accessibility-focused hardware generally emulates multiple input styles at the same time. Earlier, I mentioned Steam Input adds a layer of customization the base game doesn't. There is one problem with Steam Input. Not everyone owns Project Zomboid on Steam, and while you can add non-Steam games to Steam to take advantage of Steam Input without having to purchase anything, it would be better from a long-term perspective to implement many of the Steam Input functions natively. With proper support, Project Zomboid could one day make its way to consoles. I already enjoy its presence on handhelds. These things are pretty awesome, and Zomboid runs fantastically on the current crop of them. That's my 2 cents on the new aiming system. Peace out.